Welcome to our special feature documentary where we explore the universe of fantasy sports in India. Tracing the history of sports, we can say with confidence that sports is a great unifier of our glorious nation. From its ancient roots to its modern legacy, sports have always been at the forefront of our national identity. This spirit is captured by our sporting sensations that continue to make India proud on the global stage. Today, India's sports industry is growing at a steady rate of 11% per year and is currently evaluated at 15,766 crore rupees. India's evolution to become a robust sports economy that it is today has been inspiring. As a young nation that had just gained independence, India showed audacity to host the first Asian Games in 1951. A nation struggling with funds and resources found sports as a uniting thread to showcase its mettle. Over the next few decades, sports continued to unite Indians in collective celebrations as Indian teams across various sports conquered newer records. India's hockey team had a goal-laden staggering victory over successive Olympic Games between 1948 to 1980. Our football team won gold at 2 Asian Cup tournaments in 1951 and 1962, among other achievements. The jubilations peaked in 1983 when the Indian cricket team won their first ever World Cup. The national obsession with cricket has only grown ever since and has become almost a religion in India.
When you think of India, you think of a melting pot of cultures, of religions, of languages. In that melting pot, cricket is a unifier within our nation.
मेरा सबसे फेवरेट प्लेयर है विराट कोहली, राशिद खान, MS धोनी.
My favorite players is James Anderson, शेफाली वर्मा. गेम प्ले को समझ के अकॉर्डिंग बैटिंग करती है.
रन चेस करना हो तो सीधे बैट से खेलते हैं.
He can swing the ball both ways.
The ultimate celebration of this love for cricket manifests every year in the IPL. Taking the spirit of uniting not just India but the world in one colossal tournament, the Indian Premier League celebrates cricket and camaraderie that keeps the entire country entertained and engaged for over 2 months. IPL cuts across boundaries of regions and communities. Only one thing is paramount: a good game of cricket. By providing an equal platform for players from diverse backgrounds, the IPL transcends traditional barriers and brings cricket fans together like no other tournament.
IPL to the Indian cricket fan is a 2-month carnival. It is an extravaganza which is like nothing else. You look at whether it's a valuation of teams, whether you see the valuation of the IPL itself, which is in excess of 10 point something billion. You think of the comparisons to the NBA or to the NFL or to Formula One or to other leagues around the world. IPL in many ways has set a platform and set a mandate for other sports in India to copy paste as well. And every year we get these golden nuggets. We get youngsters coming to the fore. Guys like Ravichandran Ashwin, Hardik Pandya, Ravindra Jadeja. In more recent times, Rinku Singh, who's come up as well, Yashasvi Jaiswal. These are names that we would have never found perhaps. One season of the IPL, one big knock in the IPL makes you a household name and suddenly your life changes.
For a cricket-crazy nation, IPL means increased viewership and fan engagement. Interestingly, fantasy sports, a unique sports engagement and entertainment avenue, has emerged as the perfect partner for IPL.
All of us who are cricket fans or sports fans of any sport really want to be selectors. We think we know better than the selectors. We think these are the players who should play or shouldn't play. So what happens is, in a real-life sporting event, instead of them choosing teams, you have an opportunity to pick your own team. And it's always based on a real-life event. And what you need to do is that whenever a real-life event or sport is being played, whether a football match or a cricket match, you go there and you pick up 11 members from each side and put together your team and see how well that team does. And that's what it is. The essence of fantasy sport is participating in the sport much deeper than a normal fan would.
Fantasy Sports, a virtual team creation that allows fans to become a part of the real action in a highly engaging manner that tests their passion and knowledge of the sport by creating what they believe would be a winning team.
Fantasy sport has been around a long time. It's been there since the 50s. Wilfred Winkenbach started it with golf, interestingly, But it really caught the public imagination in the 1980s, which is what is called rotisserie sport with Daniel Okrent, where mainly it was about baseball. And once the internet happened, there was an explosion all around in all the other sports. So it's been around for more than 60-70 years. It's just that now because of the internet and because of the profusion of sport being played, it's become so big. I think the next big explosion was the IPL. And I think companies like Dream 11, one of the pioneers, was there around then. And then the growth of the IPL was mirrored by the growth of Dream 11. And by 2015-16, because of the spread of the internet as well, a lot more mobile access was there, it just exploded.
India's fantasy sports industry is quite young as compared to its global counterparts, but has experienced phenomenal growth. Today, there are over 200 fantasy sports operators and over 22 crore fantasy sports users in India. The industry has also attracted significant investments from domestic and foreign investment firms.
If you talk about fantasy sports as an industry and the growth of it, we need to look at it from different parameters. Direct revenue from fantasy sports that we looked into when we did the report last year was what? 6,800 crores. Now, in addition to this, there's an indirect revenue of about 6,200 crores that the industry is also contributing in terms of AI, data, cloud computing, machine learning, and the things like this. Now coming into some of the other parameters like tax contribution, that's about 1,700 crores, which is the contribution by the industry from 2018 to 2022. We also expect that this will grow to about 11,000 odd crores by FY27. Now let's talk GST. GST, there's about 2,500 crore of contribution from 18 to 22. This number is set to grow again with the change in the GST rate per se. So it can get up to about 14,000 crores. So when you put direct and indirect, it can get up to 26,000 crores by FY27 cumulative contribution by the industry. It is said that this industry is employing about 5,000 people as direct employment. And the ratio is about 1 to 1.5 on a direct to indirect ratio. So right now that means there are about 7,000 people who are indirectly employed. That takes you to a number of 12,500. Sports growing means fantasy sports will grow along with it. That's the single largest driver. India is the second largest smartphone user in the world after China. So no further introduction needed on this. You have the tool in your hands. Then the tool in the hand is of no use unless you have internet powering it. We have the fastest and the cheapest internet. This, we don't stand second, we stand first in terms of the cheapest internet which is available for the consumer for his usage. So after your smartphones and the internet speeds, the third thing is the payments. Digital payments growth has definitely boosted the industry per se. These are the various elements which are boosting the industry per se.
In India, the IPL has been one of the biggest growth drivers for fantasy sports. Since its inception in 2008, the Indian Premier League has transcended the boundaries of sports and become a cultural phenomenon. Setting new parameters for fandom, this event is an annual festival for a cricket-loving nation that has redefined fan engagement. For fantasy sports enthusiasts especially, it becomes a pivotal event to regularly participate, discover new talent, and test their knowledge.
To understand why people play a lot of fantasy sports just during this period, we have to understand why people love IPL. Very cliche, but it's more of a festival in India. Quality of cricket, it's absolutely top notch. It goes on for a couple of months, 74 games, 10 teams. So I think वो एक routine set हो जाता है आपका. You watch toss at 7, you get the liners by 7:05, 7:10, and 7:30 is the deadline. So you do this every single day. And I feel there's a lot of banter involved when it comes to IPL. People are so emotionally attached with the teams. A lot of data and insights are available during the IPL, and jitna zyada data hoga, it becomes a lot more predictable.
I think the IPL is perhaps the most complete competition, and because of its length and the nature of its duration and the 10 teams, it gives you a real insight and a real opportunity for any fantasy cricket lover. For a base that's already so big, the year-on-year increase is stunning. Like from 20 to 50 crores, there's a 24% increase to 2,800 crores. in 2023. Those kind of numbers year on year, given already how big the market is absolutely stunning.
Now, while IPL has significantly boosted fantasy sports has also contributed to further catalyzing its popularity. According to many reports, fantasy sports turns passive consumers of the sport into active watchers, further enhancing the viewership and engagement.
This is seen as a trend where someone who's playing fantasy sport is seen as a more invested follower, a less passive follower of sport as well. For a network or for a broadcast as well, for a fan, if they're a more invested fan, it means they're going to stay on for longer. So the retention of a sports viewer is now at a much higher rate. For me, fantasy sport isn't just what a player gets on the platform, but what a broadcaster and what a network gets out of it as well. To me, that's where I think the core of fantasy sport and why it's important to the sporting ecosystem lies.
Welcome back to our special feature documentary, where so far we've traced the astronomical rise of fantasy sports. While the growth of fantasy sports in India has been impressive, it's not been without challenges. The biggest one has been establishing its legality and reinforcing it as a game of skill.
Concept of play and games are very intrinsic to the human condition. It's something that we actually do as children. All these games have both elements of skill as well as chance. So skill is when you actually have some control over the game and you put some effort and you get some results, while chance is just the chances of life. Things that are outside our control can also influence a lot of these games. There are very few games that are entirely skill or entirely chance. There are some, of course, like if tossing a coin, you can argue is entirely a game of chance, while a game like chess is perhaps as close as it gets to a pure game of skill. So a couple of state governments have tried to ban games of skill, but that has not been very successful because the courts have pushed back and said that actually all of these businesses are legitimate businesses as games of skill. You had Punjab and Haryana, you had Rajasthan, and you had the Bombay High Court. All of these high courts recognized that this format of fantasy sport was a game of predominant skill. Eventually, the larger challenge went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed the approach taken by these various high courts. But this recognition was very important in the evolution of fantasy sport, and that game of skill is now constitutionally protected under 19(1)(g). What it also says is that the state, which is the government, cannot prohibit games of skill. At most, it can regulate games of skill. It's a very common misconception that fantasy sports is nothing other than sports betting. Fantasy sports is in fact quite different, and the courts have also recognized that it isn't betting or gambling. In fact, it is a person staking on their own skill. You're not sitting on the sidelines and staking on someone else's skill which you actually have no control over. And a lot of the operators are trying to figure out the appropriate responsible gaming policies. There was a recognition that there was a self-regulatory body called the Federation of Fantasy Sport, which was also bringing guidelines and clarity to the industry. Self-governing guidelines of this body were quite adequate, and if anyone followed the self-governing guidelines, they were also protected by what we could call the safe harbor of these decisions.
In fact, FIFS is India's first and only dedicated industry body for fantasy sports, and it has been working relentlessly to create standardized best practices for the fantasy sports industry. This is to ensure responsible growth of the industry as well as to protect consumer interest.
So in the past few years, you've had fantasy sport growing at such a huge rate, and there was no clear mandate from the government as to which department it came under or how it was governed. And therefore, the FIFS was formed, which is the Federation of Indian Fantasy Sport. FIFS Charter has a very, very clear mandate on legality. Indian organizations paying Indian taxes if they're taking money from Indian users for them to play. The second part of it definitely must be transparency. The game rules must be absolutely clear. The third part of it is absolutely financial integrity. The administrative expenses to maintain a game is separate, the prize pool is absolutely separate, and these are maintained in separate accounts, so there's clear financial accountability and integrity. And these three pillars we demand from all our members. Most of our safety is user-centric. They can have a sort of boundary for net loss after which they will not play. The second is we have very, very strong grievance redress mechanisms. And the third part of it is to make sure that all the fantasy sports platforms, the payment gateways that we have are RBI approved. They're part of our Indian ecosystem. And these are the three very, very strong ways in which we make sure that the user is guarded as much as possible. What most people don't know, and I need to tell you, is that 99% of people would not have won or lost more than 10,000 in their lifetimes. 99% of the 100% of people who play.
Last year, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology was appointed as the nodal ministry to regulate online gaming, including fantasy sports. Since then, the industry has been awaiting the formation of a regulatory body. This, they believe, will not only provide massive impetus to the responsible and sustainable growth of the industry, but will also weed out illegal sports betting platforms that are masquerading as fantasy sports and luring unsuspecting users.
Today, the Digital India Act has a clear place for fantasy sport and a place for it to grow. And I think that therefore you may have temporary roadblocks, you may have temporary issues saying that okay, taxation may be higher, lower. These are all issues we can sort. But the moment we say that okay, we are under the MeitY ministry, the government is really interested in us, as part of the AVGC policy of the government, this is something that's going to be a growth industry, which the government also looks for as a growth industry, then the future is absolutely golden.
Currently, there are close to 22 crore users that are engaged in fantasy sports, while there are 80 crore viewers of sports content, suggesting more than 75% viewers are still potential users for the fantasy sports industry to seek future growth. With the glorious growth in infrastructure around fantasy sports, the future looks promising. Welcome back to our special feature on fantasy sports, where we understand its contribution to the economy of our nation. In the financial year 2022, fantasy sports generated a direct revenue of over 6,800 crore rupees. While its contribution to the Indian economy is well established, it has also contributed significantly towards the sports economy.
Fantasy sports itself has grown tremendously over the last 6 years. So Niti Aayog has identified that this sector of fantasy sports is one of the chief growth engines for economic and technological increments per se. If you look into it, how does this happen? Fantasy sports has contributed to about 3,100 crores in terms of advertisement and marketing. This number is set to go to about 6,200 in the next 3 to 4 years. What does this mean? More money invested in the advertisement and the sponsorship on one side of it will go into further improving the sports ecosystem. There will be more consumption of sports. This grows to the grassroots levels as well. This goes to the players, this goes to the ecosystem, infra development. There has been a lot of infra development around sports which are happening in various parts. So there is development at the grassroots level, there is development at the technology level, there is development at all levels in terms of players. It makes the game bigger. The players earn more. The game itself will become more bigger per se. So there are more sponsorships coming, there are more eyeballs coming in this scenario. So it becomes a loop which will kind of help in terms of this helps the game become bigger. The game becoming bigger helps fantasy sports become bigger. So what all of this says is fantasy sports and real world sports go hand in hand and each one giving a boost to each other.
It's about consumption. How do you consume the game, right? You consume the game by viewing, by engaging on Instagram. What fantasy sports does is it gives constant engagement, which means if I play fantasy, I would watch it also, I would follow it also because I have something riding on it. I think fantasy sports always had a role to play in terms of increasing the footprint of the sport itself.
Over the years, fantasy sports platforms have become drivers for the sports commerce ecosystem. Not limiting to cricket, fantasy sports have gained popularity in supporting various leagues in popular sports like football, volleyball, kabaddi and hockey.
Fantasy sport has actually blown up over the last decade or so, and with that has also come the rise of other sporting leagues. So when you look at the emergence of a hockey league, a kabaddi league, football as well, all of this aligns so perfectly with a sports fan to just rise and rise and rise in what they are doing towards the sport, in how they're investing their interest in the sport. And by the end of it, I think you get an all-round fan, a sports fan that's suddenly becoming more and more engaged in the sporting ecosystem of our country.
So football and kabaddi do have a fantasy element in them, which helps fans be engaged. For these sports to grow, I think having a fantasy angle is very, very important, because you will get newer demographics, right? You will get people coming and playing the game, and also improve the stature of not just the sport as well, but individual players as well.
IPL's format has made it extremely popular amongst true fantasy cricket fans. Globally, fantasy sports has found itself being sought out by several major sports leagues and clubs to serve their fans better. Indian sports community can take a leaf out of their playbook and make sports better for all Indian fans. And that brings us to the close of this special feature documentary on fantasy sports. Thank you so much for watching.